to bring Ivor Davis here. True crime is always one of my favorite genres, and as you remembered, Santa Barbara has a lot of connection to true crime, including the Golden State Killer, manifested through Michelle McNamara's I'll Be Gone in the Dark. A few of the murders happened here in Santa Barbara. And also this wonderful book, it's called A Lovely Girl by Deborah Holt Larkin. This is also another Santa Barbara true crime case. That was the last, I think, the criminal was the last female executed in the state of California. Highly recommend those books. But tonight I'm really pleased because, as some of you might know, that our author has a very personal connection to this story. And I think after reading part of it and then hearing Lance Orozco's story on KCLU this morning, that there was nobody else that could write this story. So I'm very pleased to bring Ivor here, but to give him a proper introduction, please welcome Kathleen Kaiser.
Thank you. I've been working and helping Ivor for the last almost 11 years, and I just want to give you an idea of this man, who's had an incredible life, but also an incredible career, and
it's not over yet.
No, it's not. No, it better not be. He started on Fleet Street in London as a journalist, sort of heard the siren call of America and came here. And in 1962, I'm just going to give you a few highlights, was smuggled onto the campus of the University of Mississippi by helpful students, where he posed as a student, slept on dormitory floors, and was in the front row seat for James Meredith desegregating that university. They had the federal police there and everything. In '64, he got a phone call from the Times, Express, London Daily Express, that he was now assigned to fly up to San Francisco the next day and travel with this group from Liverpool called the Beatles. And he was traveling with them on their planes, in their cars, everywhere they went on their first American tour. And in '65, he was back with them and got to meet, he was the only journalist who went with them to Elvis Presley's house, because Elvis didn't know he was a journalist. So he was there. That was in his memoir that came out in 2014 called The Beatles and Me on Tour. And he just released in January the 60th anniversary of that tour edition, where he's talked about what's happened over the last 10 years with the Beatles, both Paul and Ringo.
And in 40 years' time, I'm going to do the 100th anniversary book.
Yes, absolutely, and I will be doing the PR.
Yes, you will.
But he's doing that. In '66, he traveled California with Ronald Reagan when he ran for governor of California. In '68, he was traveling with Bobby Kennedy across the state for that primary, and was just outside the kitchen door when Bobby was killed, and was there for that. In '69, he got a call from, I think something came from London. I'm trying to remember it in the book. And he took a private plane to India because these people had been arrested, and they thought it was something to do with the Sharon Tate murders. And he got to hear them, and he found out about this place called Spawn Ranch out in the west side of the valley. He went there. He got there before the police and the sheriffs did, interviewed the kids there, found out about Helter Skelter and what Manson's whole thing was. That's when he learned who Manson was. But the whole thing was, and in the spring, then Manson, of course, got arrested. All that happened. He came out with a new book called Five to Die. I believe it was April of 1970. And the prosecution found that book and took the Helter Skelter part of it and ran with it, with their theme that convicted Manson and the girls of the murders. Came from him. Okay, and he found out in the '90s because one of the people who had been on the team told him that they had his book there. In '73, he covered the Daniel Ellsberg Pentagon paper trial. He also did the Angela Davis trial. In '76, he was at the Patty Hearst trial. He did a lot of trial coverage. And throughout the mid-'70s into the early 2000s, over a quarter decade, he was a syndicated columnist with the New York Times for entertainment and television, movie and films. And he's had an outstanding career. If you go to his house, it's just papered with all these people that he's traveled with. But he is an amazing person on his own. I'm really proud to be working with him because this book is personal. Because he wasn't a reporter covering it. He was involved. He was a witness. He was somebody who thought the man was innocent. And he and Sally, his late wife, went out to prove his innocence, and this is what they found. So please welcome Ivor Davis.
Thank you. You know, it's great to be in Santa Barbara. It's got nothing to do with the book, but I tell you this. You know, I remember interviewing. Why I suddenly remember it right now, I don't know, because I have a grasshopper brain. I remember interviewing John Schlesinger, the great film director, Darling, Midnight Cowboy, and in Palm Springs, he was getting on in years, and he said to me, you know, you can live in paradise in California, as we all do, right? And he said, the problem is the weather is terrific, and you know, the year round it's marvelous. You don't know there are seasons. And he says, you know, the trouble is you go to bed when you're 26, and the next morning you wake up, you're 86. And you know, it's true. I'm living that. Anyway, it's got nothing to do with it. So the other thing is, Michael said, keep it down to 3 hours because we only have half a dozen chairs. Didn't you say that?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay, 20 minutes, okay. So who's going to put the clock on? Frank, clock going, okay. So I was going to read from my book because all authors read from their books which is the easy way out. I was going to read an hour, but then you told me it was limited. So all I wanted to do was literally, and because, you know, I'm old and my eyes aren't good, I typed up the slight introduction, and I'll keep it short. The reason I'm going to read you this is from my book, and it's my introduction, a preface to the book, and this tells you about this incredible story that I wrote many years ago, and finally, 12 years after my wife died, I've brought it out. So I'm going to read you a little bit. If you fall asleep, I'll cut it short. It won't go on for more than 3 minutes, I promise. Okay. Back? Sorry. Okay, I'm ready for my close-up. Mr.
Right.
DeMille.
Yeah.
Anybody remember that line?
Yes.
Okay, so...
Thank you.
So this kind of gives you a synopsis of the book. For us, that's Sally and I, my late wife, it all began in January 1981 on a sunny Saturday when sitting in the breakfast room of our house overlooking the Santa Barbara Channel and its chain of islands, we read in our local paper that Verna Rayler and her 8-year-old son Douglas had drowned the day before in the same spectacular stretch of water we had been admiring. Mm-hmm. And a front page headline said, "Mother, son die, efforts to save dog ends in tragedy at sea." There was a photo on the front page of the paper of the sole survivor, Fred Rayler, being transferred by Coast Guard helicopter to the hospital. Now, we were very stunned and saddened by this. We'd known Verna, who died, for 10 years, and we lived in Malibu for 10 years before we moved up the coast to the paradisical Ventura and even Santa Barbara. No, I think it's there. Anyway, so Verna had been a teacher in the children's school at San Juan Cabrillo, and our daughters, Rebecca and our son Gideon, were the same age as her son. And her kids, Kimberly and Douglas, also attended the school. And we used to go to each other's kids' birthday parties. Now, we had known Fred since his storybook marriage to Verna, although we never knew his first deceased wife, Jean. Now, after their marriage, we often bumped into Fred and Verna at school sports days and community celebrations. And we went to each other's birthday parties with the kids and all that kind of stuff. Mm. And Fred came to me one day and he said, would I allow him to co-coach the Malibu Lions young people soccer team, AYSO it was at the time. He said basically that, I don't know a thing about soccer, he said, but it's important for Douglas, my new son, to get to know me and me to get to know him. He said, I will be forever in your debt if you would allow me to be your assistant soccer coach. Well, I was deeply moved. I knew Doug had recently lost his birth father, who died in a terrible accident, and Fred showed up for midweek practices and games every week. And we even won the local soccer championship, and I presented Fred with a book about the rules of soccer. Now, on April the 4th, 1981, 3 months after this terrible drowning accident, another story hit us in the eye. Fred Rayler had been arrested for the murder of Werner and Doug. And we did not tell our children. We didn't think they could handle it. We weren't sure we could handle it. So we talked about little else for weeks and weeks. And the more we thought about it, the more we were convinced that jealousy and gossip had played a large part in what was happening to Fred. Now, there had been rumors about Fred's first wife, who actually died by drowning in the backyard swimming pool in Malibu. And there were many people, we thought, who resented Fred's newfound happiness and continued, to tell stories about Fred. And they were jealous of his ability, a good-looking guy. And we knew by the time I'd finished coaching with Fred that he was not someone who suffered fools gladly. He was not a man beloved by everyone. And he was not, and this is what I liked, he was not one of those desperately social, partying types who had invaded Malibu in that era. In other words, he was not one of the beautiful people. We liked him as soon as we met him precisely because he was so unlike those who were around him. He was quiet, speaking only when he had something to say. He was a man, we thought, of some substance and fortitude in the face of family tragedy. For some, losing 2 wives to drowning seemed too much of a coincidence. But we knew that life played peculiar tricks on people. And Fred Rayler was not someone who stayed home watching other people's adventures on television. We respected the power of the sea. We'd lived by it for most of our lives. We knew how dangerous and unpredictable it could be. Our son Gideon, like Douglas Johnson, was a good swimmer, but the ocean is not the swimming pool. When we were able to visit Fred in jail in Santa Barbara, we were amazed at his reasonableness and in calmness. He was upset at not being able to get the bail, and not being able to go home to his family on bail. But mainly because it separated him from his children. He worried about the psychological damage that his incarceration would cause them. He was longing to hug them, he said, but he was coping surprisingly well. He said the prison personnel were nice men. He said they were treating him decently, but he looked awful. His suntan had faded. His eyes were sunken. He looked depressed and sleepless. Sally and I were also depressed. How scandalous, we thought. Our friend, an innocent man, had unjustly become a victim himself. So that's all I'm going to read you. We'll go home now, and thank you. No, so I'll have to fill in the pieces. So we thought he was innocent. We went to the trial, which played out in Santa Barbara for 8 to 9 months, because I don't know if you know, but Santa Barbara jurisdiction is Santa Cruz Island, and that's one of those quirks of geographical whatever. So we went to the trial, and even though we went to the trial and heard the evidence, it was a welter of evidence. Were there bruises on the kid's head? Was there bruises on Werner's head? you know, I mean, their expert against my expert and your expert, and it was just, the jury was just befuddled. But Fred wanted to do, I mean, in retrospect, it was stupid. Fred wanted to do his opening statement, and Fred wanted to testify, which leaves you open to a lot if you testify. And, you know, Fred cried when it needed to cry. And even after the verdict came in and he was found guilty, Sally and I felt he was innocent. But then we traveled back, and we went to see him in prison, that hellhole up in Northern California called Folsom Prison. Anybody ever been in Folsom Prison? No, don't bother. Don't you bother to go to Folsom Prison. I said. So we went to see him. He was reasoned. He got along very well in jail, he said. And then we decided we were going to write the book. So he gave us a bunch of people to see in his hometown in Indiana. So Sally and I traveled back to Indiana, and we went to see 50 people. And you know what they all said? They all said, if there's money in it, Fred Rayler and his family were after the money. I should say, and I think I missed this out in my haste to let you go home, that it turned out that Fred Rayler had $820,000 of life insurance on his wife and his young stepson. And they paid double if it was an accident. So anyway, so that's the basic story. And then, oh yeah, so when we went back to Indiana, everybody said if there's insurance money, that's the Raylers, that's their reputation. And we learned, much to our horror, that there was a boating accident, there was a house that caught fire, there was a car that caught fire, and every time that happened, the Rayler family collected insurance. And would you believe that in Malibu, Fred Rayler, a house burned, a car burned, other stuff burned, and Fred Rayler collected insurance. So we decided that really that he lived, you know, he learned from his family that not murder, but insurance claims paid off. But the only thing you can think of, and most of you would agree, I'm sure, that the jump from conning the insurance companies on a burnt house or whatever, the leap to murdering somebody is just horrible. And I should add that Fred Rayler, as I mentioned when I read that, first wife died of drowning. And the reason the cops got involved was a neighbor in Malibu said, hey, you know, one wife died from drowning is a terrible tragedy. Two wives who die from drowning, something stinks. And this is why they investigated. This is why they arrested him. This is why they convicted him. Because the amazing thing is, and I'll let you, maybe I'll have a couple of questions, and I know, how much time do I have?
You got time.
Okay, I've got time. So the question is, you know, how can you have a friend you think is a good guy or a good girl, and then it turns out you were fooled? I mean, maybe all of us can, if I went around the room and said, does anybody know anybody like that? And you'll probably say, yeah, I remember so-and-so, but did he murder anybody? Probably not. He may have been a villain, or she may have been a villain, but anyway. So where are we now? So you've got basically the story, and I know that some of you might have a few questions. I should say one other thing, which is, I mean, there's so many facets to this. And one of the interesting facets is that 40 years ago, when Sally and I first wrote the book, it was going to be published, and Fred Rayler, who was in prison without possibility of parole, threatened the lawyers, threatened the publishing house with a lawsuit if the book came out. And the publishing company, which was actually, I think, Bantam, are they still in business, Bantam? Okay, they're not. Buckled, and the reason Bantam buckled at that time was because Joe McGinnis, the author, wrote a book about Captain Jeffrey MacDonald, the Green Beret captain who murdered his wife and stepson, murdered his wife and children. Anybody remember that?
Yeah.
Fatal Vision, incredible book, bestseller. And McGinnis was sued by MacDonald, and the case was in federal court in LA for 6 months. It cost the publisher $750,000 to defend it. It was a hung jury. But the difference, so the publisher got the heebie-jeebies. The publisher said, no, we can't go to jail. We can't go to court. It's going to cost us $750,000. And they actually said to me, do you have E&O insurance? And I thought, what the hell is E&O insurance? Anybody know what E&O insurance is?
Errors and omissions.
Errors and omissions. So we said no, and they said, we're not going to take the risk because this guy could sue you, and who knows, it's going to cost us money. So the moral of the story is, if you write a book, get E&O insurance. Okay. So I've rambled on, and I don't know if anybody, I think there are so many other elements, and the best way to learn the other elements is to actually buy the book. Sure. I mean, you have to be such a blatant, bloody huckster when you're an author. I mean, what author? I mean, you have to have a huckster gene if you write books in this day and age, because oh, sorry, I was going to badmouth a publisher or publishers all over. I'm not going to do that. Okay, so I wondered, with having given you this little mini picture of a huge story, if anybody might have a question or two that I've planted in you to ask me. Oh, no, I haven't.
I got one.
Yes.
What happened to Fred? Is he still alive?
I heard from Fred Rayler 3 months ago. He sent me a letter from prison. Dear Ivor. That was the only term of endearment he used. He said, I said, I need to get a copy of your book because I want to make sure, are you ready for this? I want to make sure it is not biased and it is accurate. Now here is a convicted killer who was asking me, it's like Jack the Ripper, saying I only killed 5 women, you've got me killing 7 women. I don't know how many women Jack the Ripper killed, but I mean, it's almost ludicrous. But there he is, sitting in jail with nothing to do but spend time in the law library, and he has become the guru of inmates in the jail he's at in California. So he's the go-to guy when you have a problem. So that's, go ahead.
Was there a pivotal point for you and Sally where you were feeling that your friend was being, mistreated?
Yeah.
And at what point in your investigation did you turn and say, wait a second?
Well, that's a good question. Thank you. I call it the aha moment. And the aha moment was when we were sitting in Richmond, Indiana, and we'd heard 10 different Rayler family insurance claims. And the 10 different insurance claims were identical to the ones that Fred Rayler had done. And all of a sudden, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I thought, this is it. This is the moment of truth. And I must tell you an interesting story. This is also true. So after we left, just before we were leaving Indiana, Fred Rayler's mother, Charlotte, said, I want you to come over to the house before you leave. I have a question for you. And we went over to the house, and she said, now, Ivor, be honest with me. Is there anything you discovered that will show there are skeletons in our family closet? And I said, well, every family has skeletons in their closet, don't they? And she said to me, okay. She said, now I've made some homemade elderberry wine. I love it. I'm serious. I do not lie. She said, would you like a glass? I said, well, just a sip. And she poured Sally and I her homemade elderberry wine. And I want to tell you, we sipped it with some reluctance. And I'm here to say it wasn't what I thought it was. Anyway, so that's the long-winded answer to the short question.
I'd like to ask you about when you and Sally were living this. I'm just your thought process as things were going on, and what were you feeling? I mean, this is your friend,
Yeah.
and this had to be so shocking to you both.
It was shocking. It was horrifying. It was something that I wouldn't believe happened. It took a long time. I mentioned the aha moment when I saw 6 insurance claims that his father did, 6 insurance claims that were identical that he did, and then it sort of all came into focus. But again, the problem is you don't know your friends really, as I said earlier. But you don't expect your friends to turn to be cold-blooded killers, killers for insurance profit. So it took a long time, and we realized that we were gullible. We wanted to see the best in people, and I think a lot of people do that. They meet people, and they think they're okay, and that's what we thought. And it depends who you are. I mean, when I like meeting people, and I think when I meet somebody, they're usually very nice. There's always an exception or two. Nobody in this room, fortunately. And so you say, where did I go wrong? I mean, it's just, you can't believe it. And it takes you some time to justify your complete about turn. Mm-hmm. That's it.
When did your process from being a friend to transforming into becoming full journalism mode, when was it?
Well, what happened was, after we went to Fred's hometown to talk to family members, to talk to friends, and we came back, and I went to see him at Folsom Prison, and I said to him, Fred, some of the people that I spoke to, who were your friends and associates, weren't that flattering, to be honest with you. Mm-hmm. He said, I want every single transcript. I said, well, Fred, the problem is a lot of people spoke to me under the promise I would make them anonymous. I said, I cannot give you transcripts of their interviews because I promised that if they would talk to me honestly, I would not reveal the sources. Yeah. So when he heard that, he broke off relationships with me. I never went to see him again, and I haven't heard from him since 2 months ago, when he wrote to me. So that was it. Because he was the kind of guy I realized, if you would have said, well, Arthur is a pain in the arse, then Arthur would have said, oh, this guy is a jerk, we never got along. I mean, there's always a reason for explaining why somebody makes derogatory remarks. So I realized, and we realized, that we weren't going to go much further than that, and it was a rude awakening, and that's what happened. And as I said, I haven't heard from Fred Rayler until 3 months ago, when he sent me that nice letter.
What about the children?
Well, what about Fred's children? Well, here's the interesting thing, and this is sad. His daughters from his first marriage and a daughter from the second marriage are still, I believe, true believers. And the reason they are true believers is they have been to see him in prison regularly. They have tied their anchor to Fred Rayler. And can you believe if they woke up one day when Fred said, I killed your mother, I killed her? They have been living for 40 odd years a life. I mean, how would they cope with the psychology of that? You think about it. You believe in your father, and he is a great con man, and he used to write letters to all of us, and every time he wrote a letter to all of us, if he wrote to you, he would write things that he knew about you, and it was like 6 different personalities writing a letter. Oh, wow. He was very clever with that. He'd talk about, if you were a book publicist, he'd talk about being a book publicist. So he was, I mean, like some great sociopaths, and I don't know too many sociopaths, they're a sort of, they have various personalities. I mean, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I think we're all in this room know, we've seen the TV shows, we've seen the Bundys, who are charming on the outside, but pretty evil on the inside. So that's it.
Were you able to, when you were interviewing Fred, were you able to see through that after a while?
Not really. Not really, because don't forget, we came after listening to the trial, we came to believe that he was wrongly convicted, because there was weeks and weeks and weeks of tedious, boring testimony from the pathologist. Did the kids have a bruise? Did Verna have a bruise to her head? I mean, it went on for 5 or 6 days, and I thought, wow, how can you understand this highly medical, technological stuff? You can't. But once we got down to the nitty-gritty, I mean, I think what happened was, and I didn't explain what happened in this case, but Fred Rayler took them out to Bird Rock, Santa Cruz Island in Santa Barbara County, and he said the boat overturned, and they couldn't, when he came up, the boat, after the little dinghy overturned, they came up and they were floating on their faces. I think, even though the district attorney, Stanley Roden, who's a Santa Barbara resident, even though Stanley Roden presented evidence to say there were bruises to their head, I think Fred didn't need to hit them with the oar. Fred Rayler was a powerful underwater diver. Fred Rayler knew the ocean like the back of his hand. And, you know, he was a strong man, a powerful man. And I think, you know, I thought about it, and we talked about it to Frank and other people. What did he do? He was so strong he could have probably, first of all, Verna, who had some heart problems, he probably held her under, he held his son under, and then he came up and played the terrible, tragic victim. So I think that's what happened. But and the other thing was, I went out to Santa Cruz Island 3 times, and I'm not a great swimmer. I jumped in the water, and I thought, why couldn't he have pushed them on the rocks? He said he couldn't. I mean, I was able to get up on the rocks, whereas Fred was rescued holding his wife in one hand, holding his son in the other hand, and the dog on his head. This is the way he survived. I mean, so that was the story that I disbelieved.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think I've gone on too long, but thank you all for... Oh, you got one?
Who's your publisher?
Who's my publisher? Roman and Littlefield.
Okay, are they going to be sued?
Who knows? Who knows? I mean, if they do, they've got an army of lawyers, and if that happens, maybe it'll be good publicity. You know, convicted killer sues author. I mean, actually, it's not a bad idea. Kathleen, can we do that?
Yeah, we'll work on it.
Okay. Sorry.
Ivor, thank you very much
you.
for talking about the devil and
Okay. Thank you all for coming.